Good afternoon, Isle of Faces listeners. You are listening to Sir Buckley here in middle of summer England, which of course means rainy and damp. Welcome back to the Isle, and this is our first Scrolls and Scraps episode, a companion podcast to the History of Westeros Valar Rereadis project. So, having said that, I'd like to welcome any new listeners from the History of Westeros Flick community where the Rereadis project is based. It's been really fun talking about all the early chapters of you guys on the app, so hello and welcome. Any other listeners from the History of Westeros family, I'd like to thank you also for visiting, if you haven't before. And of course, if you're a regular Isle of Face listener, then hello, how are you? And thank you for joining us on this new little mini-series of mini-casts. Before I get to what we're actually doing here today, I'll just get to some of the housekeeping. For those of you who are regular listeners here at the Isle, again, welcome back. We've had a nice little fortnight break since our last episode, which was part 2 of the season 8 finale. We had a bit of a break for 2 reasons. One, it's a good idea, just to let the TV show settle a bit whilst we find our way back to the books. And 2, we've been very, very busy. Lady Buckley is off working her new job while I am still really cracking away at the Castles book, the Great Castles of Westeros, to get that ready for either June or July like I promised it would be. I'd really like to avoid doing a George and delaying it if I can. We'll find out. Add all that into having to defend ourselves against a 5-month puppy every moment of the day, and you can see why we need a break sometimes. Still, having said that, we've got stuff in the works. We've got lots in the pipeline. On top of this Valar Rereadis project, which I'll explain for anyone who doesn't know in a moment, we still have our arguments episode where Lady Buckley and I are going to go back through what we argued about the most during season 8 and explore exactly how right I was, and at one point Lady Buckley knew that she was wrong. We're also going to do an episode on The Last Watch, the 2-hour documentary, at some point. We will get to those when we find some time. Even more excitingly, this week I'm recording a new guest episode, and seeing as the guest episodes are the backbone of the Isle of Faces, obviously that's how we started and it's our main focus. It's always great to have another of those and show off yet another member of the fandom. I'm happy to say that this week's guest we're going to record tomorrow is Lauren, better known as Shakes of Thrones on Twitter, so I'm sure all of you are aware of her work and how brilliant she is at merging the worlds of Shakespeare and Westeros. So I'm very lucky to be having her on the island, and hopefully that episode will be with you next week or maybe the week after. Let's just see how it goes. Like I said, the puppy's only 5 months old. Give me a break. On top of that, just one last note for Isle of Faces stuff. We're thinking about, it's still up in the air, we're thinking about introducing an Isle of Faces Patreon. I'm up in the air about it. There's good reasons to go for it. There's good reasons to hold off for a bit. I'd love to hear your opinions. You are the listeners, you're the fans, so please do let me know. Give us a tweet, give us an email, whatever you like. I'm not sure how it would work yet with what we could offer tier-wise, but yeah, just let me know what everybody thinks, and if there's any interest in it in the first place, because if not, then probably not a good idea. If we can pull it off, we will, because it'll only help the other faces grow, but it's a fan-based podcast, and that it shall stay. But anyway, end of housekeeping now. Let's move on. For anyone unaware or slightly confused about what we're actually doing here, History of Westeros, I'm sure most of you know anyway, have started their Valar Rereadis project, which is exactly as it sounds, a rereading of the books right from the beginning, with Aziz and Ashaya having a live stream every week and going through 7 chapters a week all the way until the end, which is a little bit off in the future. Like I said, I'm sure most of you are aware already, especially if you Flick guys who, like I mentioned, that's kind of where the project is based, and everyone's been discussing the chapters so far. This week would be week 3, so it's already 3 weeks in, and it's going really well. I've been really enjoying it because, lucky of me, I've been helping Aziz write the notes and been analysing these chapters myself. So that's great fun. The live stream's been great. The discussions on Flick, they've been great fun too. But what are we actually doing here on this Scraps and Scrolls thingamajiggy? Well, what we noticed actually this week, this was the first week I wrote some notes, and there was just too many notes. It would have been basically impossible for Aziz to go through them all without turning it into a 4-hour live stream, which would probably be a bit unfair on both Aziz and Ashaya. So we came to the idea of the Isle of Faces stepping up and being coming off the bench, so to speak, handling the scraps, you could say, hence the name. So you can call us the Scrolls and Scraps, you can call us a reserve guard, the little brother, whatever. We're kind of just a companion, picking up the leftovers from the main live stream over at History of Westeros, obviously. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to be going through all the notes that didn't make it into the stream, either because of time or because it didn't really fit in the topics as these was discussing, whatever it might be. And I should point out that these ones will just be the notes that I made. I don't want to steal anything from Aziz and Ashare because they can already make their points brilliantly without me chiming in. Now, this may only be the case for these early chapters with so much foreshadowing and setup. Like Aziz said, we're going to have more notes for these ones, which is weird because the actual chapters themselves are way, way shorter, so that's a bit ironic. So perhaps some weeks all the notes will be used and we won't have one of these Scrolls and Scraps minicasts, and other weeks we will. We'll see how it goes, and as always, send any thoughts and suggestions you might have to make it better. I'm aware you haven't had to put up with any podcasts with just me for a little while, so welcome back to that and my deep voice. I know I sound emotionless, I'm really not, but I know that's what I sound like. Let's kick things off. There's quite a few notes to get through, especially for those first few chapters. Just so everyone's aware, I'll be following essentially the same format as Aziz did on the live stream. I'll go through some of the main topics where maybe a random note didn't get through, or at times there could be a whole topic that Aziz just didn't have time to touch on. It might even be something that's occurred to me since. Who knows? Let's find out. So, we begin with Tyrion 1, and already slight adjustment because we were talking on Skype yesterday, myself and Aziz, and Aziz made a good point that the numbered character chapter titles are going to mean less and less as we go on. It's all very well having to remember Tyrion 1 because you just have to remember his first chapter, which is much easier. But if I just randomly said Tyrion 5 or Tyrion 9 or whatever it could be, people have much harder time remembering those straight off the bat. You have to work it out a little bit. So I made the suggestion, maybe we should look at kind of like Friends type titles, like the one with, so this one, Tyrion 1 for example, would be something like the one with the Lannister luncheon, because Tyrion has lunch with the rest of the Lannister family, and he also runs into Joffrey beforehand, so hopefully this jogged your memory from Sunday if you watched the live stream, or from way further back if you didn't. Either way, let's get to it. So, beginning of the chapter, Tyrion wakes up in the library, comes down, he sees Joffrey, and we get the slap, which is he's covered. Especially the TV aspect of it is quite, I'm sure you've seen it replayed a lot of times, because it's quite good to see Joffrey getting slapped. Then again, is it actually that good to see Joffrey getting slapped? Because, like as he said, he is a child, and I just wanted to expand on that a bit, because we all know what Joffrey's like. We've all seen the show and read the books for most of us. And I think even at this point, we know he's an arrogant rich kid. So we're not that against seeing him being put in his place and slapped against someone. Okay, we don't really know Tyrion, but it's his chapter, so he's serving as the protagonist in this case. But when you stop and think about it, he is actually being physically abused by someone twice his age. Which, yeah, different spin on it. And obviously the effect this has on Joffrey, whether it's been happening before, I'm sure we're going to assume this isn't the first slap Joffrey's had, and how that's turned him into what he is, and he's obviously not learning any kind of lesson from Tyrion here, he's just remembering it as the Hound warns. Tyrion also isn't learning anything. I wanted to put out that even after everything that Tyrion goes through, this flaw of his exists right to the end of the narrative that we currently have. In his first chapter, he's slapping Joffrey to try and teach him a lesson. And Tyrion, at the end of Dance, who has gone through a heck of a lot, I'm sure you'll agree, he slaps Penny, the dwarf companion that he finds during Dance. So, a lot of, I don't know, can we call it growth for Tyrion? It's a strange old arc. It's definitely on the downward trend, but some things don't change right from the beginning here, where so much is different for everybody, and he's still doing it 5 books later. So that's just something to bear in mind, that, yeah, some of Tyrion's worst attributes were here all along, even when, we still see him as good and right and everything else. I did point out also that Tywin never gets a mention in this chapter, which is just kind of nuts. I know Aziz mentioned that. I think it really does come back to these layers of Lannisters coming back on the strings. That's what Tyrion calls it, dancing on the strings of those who came before us. And that's exactly what he's doing with Joffrey now. The slap from Joffrey is coming from the elder generation, as I'm sure slaps came from Tywin, which is Tyrion's elder generation. And Tywin, for his money, probably felt slaps of humiliation from Tytos, his father, who was famously taken advantage of by the other West Lords, and that's kind of what forged Tywin into who he is. So it's just a knock-off, trickle-down effect. Not that I don't think Tytos was particularly bad to Tywin, so it's a slightly different situation, but you can just see goes from Tytos to Tywin, Tywin to Tyrion, Tyrion to Joffrey, and Joffrey's probably getting it, well, he is getting it from Robert as well, because we know that Robert has hit him also. So whether we want to admit it or not, that all that contributes to what Joffrey becomes or has already become. It does put me in mind of Viserys quite a lot, having the end of season 8 and looking back at these early chapters. I've really been thinking a lot about why Viserys turned out like he did and why Joffrey turned out like he did, and we can't really make excuses for either one of them, but there are reasons, there are backgrounds for both of them. I think maybe Joffrey slightly worse anyway. It did kind of seem like he was going to go that route anyway. Maybe Viserys was too, but it does pay to think about why George doesn't just write, or doesn't tend to write, just blatantly evil psycho characters. They do have backgrounds. Even the Mad King, who is supposed to be the embodiment, the famous mad one, cruel and wicked and everything else, he did have reasons. He wasn't all that bad before the defiance of Duskendale. Maybe there were seeds there, much like Joffrey in his childhood, but all these things contribute, and they're all dancing on the strings, just like Tyrion says. Let's move on though. Anyway, Sandor again was the next topic during the live stream, but I didn't really have anything extra to add to that, so we'll go forward to this Lannister luncheon. Mainly, my main thought during all this is that this is the only time we see them all together. This is the only time we really see them as a family, which I know Aziz mentioned. I'm sorry, I must apologise. There will be some kind of crossover during these notes, because sometimes Aziz has to say half of it, not the other, and I can't just say the second half of a sentence because it'll seem a bit weird. So my apologies if it sounds like you've heard some of these before, but I am trying to add some extra stuff too, if you'll bear with me. Anyway, Lannister luncheon, they're all together. Tyrion says to Jaime, Myrcella and Tommen, no Joffrey, luckily for us. And yeah, this is the one time really that we get to see them as a family, which, as Aziz mentioned, we don't actually even get for the Starks. But it's weird because there's so much Cersei and Tyrion, especially Cersei and Tyrion interaction, Tyrion and Joffrey, Jaime and Cersei a little bit later on in Feast and some Storm. So this is a rare treat to get to see the three of them all kind of operating and bouncing off one another, because this really goes far for George's early message of this not being a black and white series. I think he needed this scene to show that this isn't a story about good and evil, and these aren't just this isn't just the bad family compared to the good family of the Starks. And we're certainly going to learn that. We've only got these two families really at the moment. We're certainly going to meet many more. It's not about good and evil. These are families of different members and different relationships. They've all got fuzzy morals, and this is all translated over in a breakfast scene that lasts about 3 pages. So it's just a mark of the early brilliance of George in this series and how he's compacting so much into not a lot. And this scene is really as close as peace comes for a family who's eventually going to think of each other all as enemies. Not so much Myrcella and Tommen. They're both still quite sweet and innocent even by the end of Dance, although it could go that way if Myrcella gets crowned, if that ever goes that way, and they could be played off against each other. That's definitely been spoken of a lot. Certainly Tyrion thinks about it, but the adults, they definitely all become enemies. I don't think we need to rehash Tyrion's feelings for Cersei and how his mindset is at the end of Dance, and then Jaime and Cersei, they have a bad split. Jaime throws her letter in the fire. So they all become enemies kind of before and after Tywin's death, but especially after. Not that he had a particularly great grasp on his family structure beforehand, but once he goes, it all falls apart and everyone hates each other. And that's even without mentioning Tyrion and Jaime's relationship falling apart, which is the strongest part of this, the only one where they actually both like each other genuinely. And that goes with the whole Tysha thing. So Tyrion, not fond of the rest of his family, and none of them are really. So that's always fun to think about. Back to this just nice little lunch breakfast scene when they're all happily sat together, and not actually happily, but on the surface polite at least, which is more than we get later on. As you touched on my note about the themes of the outcast in this book and the books onward, and Tyrion kind of being chief of them among those, and especially if he kind of rounds out the big three. We've already got Jon, he's the outcast, he's the bastard. We've already got Dany, she's the outcast obviously because she's off on the edge of the world being thrown into savage lands. And now we've got Tyrion, who is the real embodiment of the outcast, even though he's not really because he's still part of the main family, but physically at least he's the most obvious outcast, I suppose you could say, just to look at him. And those three are often cited as the main characters of the series, especially as we go on, and especially relevant given the theories of three-headed dragons and how people think they're all going to end up united, maybe to defeat the others. So this again is George tying early strings around these and saying, look, you should be looking at these three as a group, even though they are at least quite separate. They will be soon enough. To go back to the beginning of the chapter where Tyrion is off in his library having a read instead of sleeping, much like many people I'm sure we all know. We talked about how later on the Winterfell library burns, and probably these books with them. And I think, ancient knowledge lost or knowledge lost is, again, very reflective of Tyrion and his whole arc, especially in King's Landing. He always knows so much, but he struggles to impart that on the world. He knows a lot that could do the small folk a lot of good, and does do. It saves them. But he can't impart that on them because he's the hated imp. He's the hated demon monkey. And, it's just... I think the burning of those books and the not being able to get across their information is just a good little reflection of what we're going to have to expect from Tyrion's story, and him never being able to quite connect. He thinks he can, and then either gets betrayed or people die, or can never get his point across. So I think we see that early in old books left on a shelf and then burnt. Tyrion knows all these things and can do all this good, but he can't because of who he is, and then he gets shipped off to Essos anyway. In terms of the tone of this chapter, I found it very, very different to the other. The Stark. We've mainly got Stark. Well, we have only got Starks and Daenerys so far, and Jon. He is a Stark, but all those characters you can fit into the tropes or kind of characters you would expect in fantasy. You can even, if you really want, slot them into the Gods of the Seven. We've got a warrior. We can probably assume that Jon is going to become a warrior. We've got the father in Ned. We've got the mother in Catelyn. We've got the maid in Daenerys. Okay, no one's stepping up to be the smith or the stranger quite yet. Those are all characters that readers could have guessed, but not so much Tyrion. You can't really put him into one of those slots, unfortunately. But I think Tyrion's view of the world, his being more skeptical and cynical, is really well timed, because we must remember that Tyrion 1 immediately follows Bran II, or in our Friends type titles, the one way falls out the tower, or the one way gets pushed, I should say. So I think that's also telling. George is trying to tell you, we get our first really skeptic POV right after the very event that shouts out, there is stuff to be skeptic about. You should be thinking about this. You should be questioning, which is obviously what Tyrion is already doing in this lunch, and he's looking at Cersei and Jaime and trying to put two and two together. On the same vein, on the subject of structure and where to put these chapters, as I'm sure it's always a hard choice for George, it makes sense to have a POV from a grotesque. That's what Tyrion technically is in this world, because it's in this chapter, in the chapter of a grotesque, that we learn Bran will be a cripple for the rest of his life, and cripples, bastards, and broken things. That's the grouping. So it's a little connection to have that information, that announcement made in the POV of someone who really knows what that means. Jaime can make his comments, but he doesn't actually really know yet, and Tyrion does. And that connection between him and Bran, that just solidifies things for the saddle and stuff like that later on, Tyrion and Bran. The last point for Tyrion 1, the one of the Lannister luncheon, we see him using wit as a defence. He's got a strong wit, he's got the sarcasm, he's used to these jokes, he's had to put up with them for a whole lifetime, and he has told Jon, and he will later, use it as your armour, blah, blah, blah. And through the course of the books, we'll see this slowly erode away, really. Tyrion, he can put up with the jokes, but every man's got a limit, and he dispenses with the wit as a defence thing, especially by the end of Storm. He's just got no use to it because he's tired of defending, and he just kind of lets it all overtake him, as we know from Dark Tyrion in Dance, which is a rather somber note to end Tyrion 1 on, but there we go, we've got others to get to. Let's go to Jon II, which I will name the one with the frosty stepmother. The one where Jon has to say goodbye to Catelyn and Arya and Robb, which are both a bit nicer than the first one. Let's see what we've got left for Jon II, what we couldn't get to. So I see Jon's chapter as the breaking of this first mini act of the book. We've had this little self-contained world, ignoring the Daenerys chapters, this self-contained world within Winterfell, the family life and the family field castle. It's our first real setting. If you disregard the prologue and the beginning of Bran 1, it's our first real. It's where we associate the beginning of the series with, and it's never ever going to be the same again after this point. So that ties nicely into the leaving childhood behind theme that almost all the characters come in to play with: Jon, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Daenerys, and Ned and Catelyn also are involved in that leaving of home. Neither of those two get to go back again, and very much the same for Jon, although he might get to go back again. Still, he has to leave that behind. He's going to a very, very different home, which we'll get to in the following Jon chapters. And as he's mentioned, we had a note about how Winterfell is different, it's gone, and Jon is saying goodbye, yes to Bran, but to his childhood as well. But he's not quite there yet. He is still a child, even if he's summoning the strength in this conversation to ward off Catelyn for the time being, or stand up to her in a way. That kind of melts away when he sees Bran being thin and his eyes open, kind of creepy and not looking good. So his line of don't die, Bran, please, that sounds like a child's begging, like it does a little bit later when he asks Robb how long it'll be until he visits Castle Black. He's got all the defiance of a man against Catelyn, but he's still kind of got this bargaining thing like a child would, where he is leaving, but he doesn't want to completely leave, even though he kind of knows he really is. Speaking of Catelyn, there was talk about how guilt obviously plays into this chapter, of her being guilty, praying for Bran to stay, and she thinks it's her fault, which is very similar to the TV scene of when she's talking to Robb's wife Talisa. And this is a show-only part, I believe, that she's saying about when Jon was ill as a child and she prayed for him to die, and then she felt guilty about that, and she thinks that's the reason why all these terrible things have happened to the Starks. And that's not in the books, but still, regardless, guilt is a very strong theme throughout Catelyn's arc, and it always, or a lot of it at least, always winds back to this situation with Bran. And like as you said, we mentioned it was first off guilt about praying for him to stay, and then she has a lot of guilt about leaving, which would kind of come to be true because she doesn't get to go back, and Bran, in her mind anyway, dies before she can go back. As to the conflict between Jon and Catelyn historically through Jon's life, there was a lot of talk about that in Sunday's live stream. There's a lot of talk about that all the time. It commonly comes up in all podcasts eventually, or whoever you're going to listen to, or Twitter or anything. But just from my point of view, I think it's clear Jon has been suffering abuse from Catelyn for all this knife fire neglect. Neglect is a form of the abuse, however you want to frame it. That's the bottom line. And she's kind of got this venom towards him that she obviously doesn't hide. To be fair, I think that speaks to the strength of Jon's connection to his siblings, that he hasn't turned out a much worse kind of problem even with that kind of abuse. And I'm sure part of his inner resolve is partly responsible for that as well. But how easily could he have been entirely bitter and looking to pay that back and get back at Catelyn for all these years, where he was made to feel the outsider? He could have turned out very, very differently. Essentially, I think Jon very easily could have been Theon. That's, even though we don't see much of it in this book, that is how Theon ends up feeling, very resentful, wanting to get back to his other family, which is a different situation from Jon. Jon doesn't have a different family, and he's never known anything else. But you can see it's that, which we will see in a second, it's the strength of a relationship with Robb, strength of a relationship with Arya, that's kept Jon from going down that road despite all the difficulty. Now, to be fair, I do think I don't think Catelyn is probably like seeking him out to. I mean, she doesn't really speak to him, so it's not like she's searching Winterfell for Jon so she can say something mean to him. But like we said, it's the neglect, the casting aside, the absence of warmth. That is a form of abuse, which Jon has been suffering. So it speaks to Jon as a person that he hasn't ended up worse because of that. And obviously this abuse of Jon is kind of Catelyn's greatest flaw. She never allows this innocent baby boy into the thing she loves most, which is her family, duty, honour. That's obviously Catelyn Tully's ingrained coding, if you like. She loves her family so much that she cannot allow any reminder to be in there that there might be a chink in the armour that is, her family, her bubble. Because I think in her mind, if she, acknowledges Jon or talks to Jon or just acts like it's normal or okay for Jon to be there, then that's kind of giving a pass to Ned's supposed infidelity, and that, that's just a bit more than she can bear to think about. She doesn't want this besmirchment on her perfect family, which I think connects her to Sansa a bit, as we're going to find out in a second. Sansa is still young enough to believe in perfect families and heroes of songs, and everything's got to be just right. And I don't think Catelyn, she's obviously not like that. She's grown up, she knows the realities of the world, but she still wants to ignore this black mark in Jon as much as possible. She doesn't want him to ruin it, as Sansa would put it. Again, we'll see in a minute. Just this last point on Jon and Catelyn, because like I say, it was discussed enough. But if I remember correctly, I probably have to look this up, but Ned and Jon were already back at Winterfell, back from the war, when she and Robb made their way up from Riverrun when Robb was a baby. So I think that's got to figure in very largely for the basis of Catelyn's hatred for Jon. If you can imagine how she must have felt bringing home a firstborn son and the heir to your new husband, and who will someday be the ruler of your new home, and very, very important, big part of the war effort was this whole marriage, and supposed to marry his brother, but now you've married him, but you've given him a son, you've done your duty, family duty, honour, and then you get there in this strange, horrible, cold place to find he's actually already got one. He already has a son. And not only that, but you're allowed to know nothing about it and no explanation other than that he's a bastard, so at least you don't have to worry about the air stuff, but still bit of a kick in the teeth. So we can see where this comes from for Catelyn. It's not just outright logic. There is logic to it, if you want to call it logic. I just mentioned a minute ago Bran's physical appearance. He's wasting and thin and twisted, and there was some people from the Flick community in the chat, I'd have to look at names, forgive me, were saying twisted limbs, twisted legs, made them think of twisted tree roots like we're going to see in the cave. So that was a really good catch. I didn't think of that. But the main thing that got me creeped out was that his eyes are open the whole time. You definitely wouldn't like looking at. I'm not surprised Catelyn's so freaked out and not doing well, because it'd be bad enough to see him lying there as if he was asleep in this kind of coma thing that he's in. But to lie there with his eyes open, then it really must. It's not good. And speaking on Bran, I think George is still very much in the vibe of Bran being the main character, which he might turn out to be, especially given season 8. But really, in this beginning, you can see there's a focus. There's 3 chapters in a row where Bran is the focus, even if he's not the POV. We've got Bran II, where he has his fall, so he's obviously the focus there. Then Tyrion's chapter, the conversation with Joffrey, and then again at the lunch table, that's all about Bran, that he's alive, but he's in this coma thing. And then this chapter, Jon, the first part of this chapter is about Jon having to say goodbye and the extent of Bran's injury. So we've got 3 in a row here where Bran is really still, the centre of this kind of circle in Winterfell with everything that's going on. After that, he goes to talk to Robb, which is much nicer. I don't think we've got too much to add to this, other than, it's an emotional goodbye, and you can tell they're kind of being teenagery and not admitting it too much, because that's not cool. But from then, as he said, that we've only got these 2 scenes of them together in the present. We'll get memories later on, but we see them kind of being competitive teenage boys when they have their little horse race, and now we've got an emotional goodbye. So it's quite a big switch, quite a big leap from, tone to tone. So there's a lot for the reader to absorb, but it's important, very important for the testing of Jon's vows later at the end of the book, because without this scene, I'm not sure if that comes off as strongly when Jon gets the news of war in the south and he wants to go and ride off and help Robb. Without this, we could still glean its meaning, but this just adds another deeper emotional level. And then it gets much more emotional, much deeper when we see Arya and Jon and Needle also. And we discussed that there's vibes that Arya's connection with Nymeria is stronger, or if not, maybe not stronger, at least faster. It grows faster, because this is the first hints we're really getting here. Then the other Stark children, in fairness to Robb, we don't have his POV, so we don't know how fast he connected with Grey Wind, because he obviously does have quite a good connection. But for all we know, Bran's major connection to Summer is obviously through his warging, and that comes from his fall. Whereas Arya doesn't have that, and yet she still is very connected to Nymeria, and later will still have that warging connection. So it's something to think about what Arya might have achieved with Nymeria had they not been separated on the King's Road in next week's chapters. She had kept her together and figured out all this extracurricular stuff that they can do together, free of the influence of the three-eyed crow, in theory anyway, as well. Who knows what they could have been doing? Something very similar to Robb and Grey Wind, possibly. Moving down, then we go to the opposite feeling of Jon's meeting with Arya and Jon's meeting with Catelyn. Obviously, very, very different relationships, even though he's talking to mother and daughter. So on one side, we've got Lady Catelyn, who was the reason he wants to leave Winterfell, and his sister Arya, the reason that he would want to stay at Winterfell if he was going to stay. And this is all seeds for later, because this is why Jon remembers Winterfell fondly. Although he does obviously think about being a bastard and all these nasty things from Catelyn, he also focuses very strongly on the sibling relationships and that drawing him back to Winterfell. This is why he fondly remembers Winterfell, why he fondly remembers Arya, and it just reaffirms Winterfell as a good place for him. Now, that might have happened when comparing to Castle Black anyway, because Castle Black ain't the most fun of places, but still that connection to Arya and Robb also, and I'm sure the other siblings too, that's what makes it home turf still for Jon, even if it never felt like home when he was there. And that does transfer over to the reader. It was home for us. It was our first places where we were introduced to many, many characters, if you think about it. Even if it's not their POV introductions, this is where we get to meet a lot of the biggest characters we're going to see, and it just seems like all roads eventually go back to Winterfell. We expect the series to move back there again. So as much as Jon remembers it fondly and wants to get back there, as does the reader. I'm sure we all missed it very much in Storm and Feast, but we didn't get to see it very much. So that difference between Catelyn and Arya is interesting because, like Aziz got to in the live stream, Sansa and Catelyn, they're much more like they're ladies. And Arya, like we said earlier, is the outcast. She wants to be the fighter and, go and talk and play outside and whatever else. She doesn't like doing her needlework. So there's a bit of a distance between Catelyn and Arya. We don't see scenes of them together, I don't think. I'd have to look. And we don't get much of them thinking on each other. Not as much anyway. Catelyn, to be fair to Catelyn probably thinks that Arya is dead, so she focuses on trying to keep Sansa alive. And Arya, for her money, she does think of her mother, but it comes much later. And obviously in Storm, after the Red Wedding, we have Arya really connecting with her mother because she knows about her death and is, through Nymeria, not saves Catelyn, but brings her body out of the river, and you can see kind of those two coming back together closer than we ever saw them. So this is all important for much later on. And like I just said, Catelyn would be the reason Jon would want to leave. Arya's the reason he wants to come back. And considering that coming back presents itself as a viable option in Dance when Stannis comes a knock-in, I don't think it's coincidence that that's also when Melisandre tells him about what he thinks is Arya in her vision, because that's the one thing that can distract Jon from his duty. I don't think, Winterfell wasn't enough on its own, even with those happy memories of seeing it as home turf, whatever. That's not enough to shirk duty for Jon. Arya is, and we can go all the way back, scroll all the way back, and find why that is in this chapter. Okay, Daenerys. There's a lot of notes for Daenerys, which I think Aziz got to most of them, but that was probably the biggest chunk. Very interesting, this chapter overall, if we're going to look at it from beginning to end. Oh, I didn't give it a friend's name, did I? So what's this? Daenerys 2? Is that right? Is it 3? No, it's Daenerys 2. What should we call this one? We could give it a few names. We'll call it the one with the Dothraki wedding. We'll stay on the safe side. But if we're going to look at this whole chapter from beginning to end, I see it as transitioning from large to small, both in the physical sense and the more hypothetical atmospherical sense. We go from a huge crowd and noises and dance and gifts and all these new people popping up all over the place to a quiet space for two people in the middle of the night. That's obviously the physical. Daenerys is seeing two extremes here. The big crowd and all the noises and stuff she's probably not all that used to. She has been to a lot of cities, true, but she's normally just with Viserys. And then she gets taken off to what felt like the loneliest place on earth. Just her and Drogo under the stars. Very, very different. More overall sense, we go from the grand plans. Now, obviously, that's not said up front, but we know, having read forwards and knowing what Varys and Illyrio are up to, we go from grand plans to invasions and reclaiming thrones and schemes. All these grand plans of 1,000 different plots melded together with 1,000 different people playing small roles. We go from all that down to just two people, one-on-one, becoming intimate with one another. So there's complete opposites presented in one chapter from beginning to start. It's very, very interesting. We're already down to the miscellaneous part of this chapter, as he's got to most of the notes here. But talking about the books, we had a lot of book talk. I think George was trying to hit us over the head that books are important in this world, and ours. I think it's significant that Jorah specifically gives Daenerys the books about Westeros. She has that nice quote about how much it means to her, even though I don't think we actually get a follow-up of her reading any, which is a shame. But this is the beginning of how important Jorah is to Daenerys, obviously, he is her entire connection to the continent she wants to conquer. Remember that she's never been there. She's doesn't know anything really about current day Westeros, and even past Westeros, she's basing off Viserys, which is not your best bet for getting a clear picture of things. So Jorah is it, really. He's her looking glass into this faraway land that is her entire focus. It's her whole life. So Jorah is incredibly critical to that, at least until he has to go away and Sir Barry turns up. But he is that entire connection, and that starts right here. This is his first act towards Daenerys, giving her information about Westeros. And that's how he'll continue for a little while at least. There's a lot of talk, both in the live stream and elsewhere, about these the line about Dothraki putting on rich fabrics and wearing perfume, visiting the three cities. And it's kind of a head scratcher because, if you hadn't read the books and I said that to you, you'd probably look at me like I was incorrect. Because we don't really ever hear anything about that again. We don't hear anyone referencing the Dothraki dressing stylishly, or even having manses. We definitely don't see any of it while we are still with the Dothraki through Daenerys. And although they don't really have time to explore this greatly, it's another common part of these kids growing up in seeing one thing and then seeing what is actually happening behind the door, underneath, so to speak. Because Daenerys sees the palace and she sees the fabrics and the perfumes, and then very quickly that's followed by the wedding with the murders and the public sex, and it continues that theme of, every character, every place, there's always another layer, which pretty much all our characters are going to discover at various speeds. It's just a weird note that the manses and the fabrics, I don't know if George just kind of forgot about that, but it's interesting because it's the last real attempt to paint the Dothraki as anything other than like the ravaging hordes, even though Eyrie and the Blood Riders, they stick with Daenerys. We're not really given any more insight once we leave face Dothrak, or leave wherever Drogo died. So it's just interesting, but maybe that is to come in Winds, to be fair, because Daenerys seems to be going back there, so maybe we're just going to get a bit of more window into Dothraki culture. Maybe not. Maybe there just isn't time for that, or maybe George just doesn't want to complicate something that's been so solid since the early chapters. Maybe not. There's a lot of quotes about feeling alone in this chapter, which Aziz did touch on. It says, she never felt so alone as she did in that massive horde. It says she was only 13 and all alone. Well, this chapter is a gateway to that loneliness ending for a little while. She's going to get back to that loneliness, but it's a bit different afterwards. She's about to become part of a vast Khalasar and part of a tribe that shares pretty much everything together, at least experience-wise. Maybe not their tangible items so much, but they're a pretty open bunch. So she's going from living with one person, and obviously she feels quite detached from him, so it's a very lonely existence, to living with all these people that share everything together and everything's open and you're surrounded. So, and although in this first instance at the wedding she does feel alone in the crowd, that old trope of being alone in a crowd, she will soon be integrated into them and she won't feel alone. She'll feel empowered and strong because she's got her blood riders and her handmaidens. She's the Khaleesi. She has the Dothraki around them. And even afterwards, even after many of them leave her with Drogo's death, that feeling of loneliness doesn't really return until she's in Marina and starts going sideways that way. Then she gets to be lonely again. But this first chapter is her stepping through the gateway from loneliness and powerlessness to something else, and I think that ties very nicely into the fact that this is her first separation from Viserys. I'm sure she can put two and two together here, that she feels better and less alone away from Viserys. Not too hard to figure out. And this is also the first instance of something that Daenerys is going to have to do several times, and that's meeting a new culture and getting used to their way of doing things. That's one of her strengths by the end of it all, is that she's so adept at meeting people and getting used to customs and how to address different cultures and classes, blah, blah, blah. And obviously the people around her are a very large part of that. So Jorah and Missandei and more people as we go on, especially once she gets to Meereen. But if you think about it, so this is just the first one, but she has to do it with the Qartheen, she has to do it with the Astapori, she has to do it with the Meereenese, and eventually she's going to have to do it with the Westerosi, because again, she's got all that history there, and she might have Ser Jorah, and she might have Ser Barristan, and soon she might have even more Westerosi people there, but it's still a foreign land to her. So she's got to get used to all that after being in very, very different places. And even like somewhere like Astapor or Yunkai, where she didn't exactly hang around, it's still a skill that not everyone would be so adept at. So it's one of Daenerys' strengths, and this is her learning that particular weapon for her. Okay, Daenerys, that's that. So at this point on Sunday was where Aziz reached his mid-roll, so we will follow suit and do the same thing. For those who aren't regular listeners to our faces, whenever we have a guest on our midway point, we like to play Podrick's People and give them a chance to just give a quick shout out or shine a quick light on someone from the fandom who's caught their eye that week or that month or whatever it may be. Now, we don't have a guest today, it's just me, so I'm going to take a turn at doing it. And I'm going to bring you two Podrick's Peoples. And the first is Naomi Makes Art on Twitter, that is, at Naomi Makes Art. And this week, I think it was yesterday, maybe the day before, she posted some artwork of Aegon V, Egg, grown-up Egg, that is, and his lovely wife, Betha, and their children, their 5 children. 5. And it's brilliant artwork. It's in a kind of cartoony style. I don't know the lingo. I apologise, Naomi, if you're listening. But it is amazing. You should really go and have a look at it. That's Naomi Makes Art on Twitter. It looks like you're about to play a game on the Switch, the Nintendo Switch. That's what it looks like. It looks like these characters are about to move and you're about to play a game of them. It looks amazing. Incredible stuff. So please go and take a look at that. Second shout out goes to the famous Joe Magician, which I'm sure you all know from Maester Monthly and from Twitter. He's been asking some good questions on Twitter recently. First, he asked for everyone's kind of hottest take, if you like, however you want to phrase that. He did a better job than I did. And he also put up a good poll the other day about just how awful Tyrion's murder of Shae was, which did throw up some we will say interesting, some incorrect responses, but a lot of good discussion also. So please go and check out. He always puts up these kind of good questions, and there's more good stuff on his Twitter feed. Anyway, having said that, he has started talking a lot about Con of Thrones, which I am unable to attend. So I've changed my mind. Please shun Joe Magician. Do not like any of his tweets. Never talk of him again. He's being mean to me. Okay, back to the action. We'll go a bit quicker through these chapters. There's not nearly as much that Aziz wasn't able to get to. First is Eddard II, or the one with the joyride, we'll call it. Robert and Ned going on a bit. Well, Robert goes on a joyride, Ned gets taken on one. It's more succinct, more true. And many things about this chapter, but I think probably one of the ones we're going to see repeated the most is Ned getting stressed out and then thinking of Lyanna, or thinking of this promise me, Ned. You know, a focus of the fandom still, and it will be for a while yet, I imagine. But the thought I had when rereading this was, again, obviously that this is the first of many stressful times for Ned to come, and especially safety of children, especially when we get to him being arrested, and he has his whole, would I trade my honour for a few more years? And Varys reminds him of his daughters, or daughter specifically, I can't remember the wording. And safety of children again. Nothing new to say that Ned is horribly afflicted with memories of dead children at all, especially being in the south again. It just all comes rushing back. With that in mind, it's an odd thing to say, but maybe it was a mercy that Ned died when he did, given what happens in the Riverlands and to his children. I'm just thinking, I wonder if there's an alternative timeline where, I don't know, he either gets kept in the black cells, or even if he gets sent to the wall, but everything else happened as it did. Can you just imagine if he had to live with the knowledge of Sansa being Joffrey's prisoner, and if he could, not they would, but if he did know about what I had to go through, and even forgetting that, and obviously not mentioning Robb dying and everything that's going to happen to Bran and Rickon, don't forget Rickon. But even forgetting his own children, if he knew about all the atrocities that are going to happen across the Riverlands, and then spreading out what's to come with Euron and everybody else, maybe it is a mercy that Ned went when he did, because at least he didn't have to put up with that. We noted that Robert rages like a storm in this chapter, while Ned is quiet and reserved, and that's them reflecting their own family histories. Robert comes from the Storm Kings. He comes from Storm's End. He's supposed to rage and thrash and make a lot of noise, whereas Ned comes from the quiet direwolves who kind of stare you out. He's more stoic. They're representing their family traits right on show for us here. We get from Robert the first of his, in quotes, offhand comments. They're not really offhand, but he's saying, he's kind of mentioning, oh, wouldn't it be good to leave them all behind? Oh, wouldn't it be good to become something else and go off to the disputed lands and be the sellsword king, or whatever it is he says. And it's just giving us a real clear window. A lot of these early chapters, Ned chapters, are, but I think this is maybe the first one where it's really laid out obvious to us what's going on in Robert's soul when he talks, when he's so bitter about wanting Lyanna and not a crown, and wanting to burn the wheelhouse and ride away from it all. It's really very clear to us, and Ned probably is realising more so what's happening. This is not a happy man. It's not a happy chappy, even though he is their king, the most powerful man. So, and that sets a precedent in itself. We know what's going to happen to all these kings, even though being king is technically the end goal of the Game of Thrones that everyone is playing. And I think that's one of the ironic points of the series, that it's not very fun or very long lasting often. We get that kind of confirmed where or we can see it as confirmed when Ned's final thought, we mentioned as he's read this out, where is a man could not always be where he belonged, though. And in my mind, I think there's no doubt Robert probably thinks the same thing, but in the opposite way. He probably believes he belongs out here in the wild, in the Barrowlands, and the saddle, and he belongs free, riding free with his warhammer, but he's tied back to his horrible iron chair. Moving down then, there's a little bit about Jorah in this episode, Jorah Mormont, and specifically Ned's kind of interaction or near interaction with him. I think Aziz's got to a different point on this, but I think George includes Ned's thoughts on Jorah specifically here to reflect Ned. I think it's a conversation to show that Ned isn't like some softie, because we obviously have him here saying, no, don't kill the children, and which not fair to call him a softie for not wanting to kill children, but he wants to show that Ned is actually politically astute. He is actually good at ruling, which we don't really get evidence of in Game of Thrones. It all comes after Ned's dead, when the North starts to fall apart, and you realise what a good job Ned was doing of holding this place together, and how respected he is by the hill tribes and everyone else, and the Ned and all that. So I think it's George puts this in specifically to show Ned knows how to rule his own country, and he knows the price of ruling, and he knows how to do the job, which we did get we already know from his beheading of Garrod in the Bran chapter. I think this is just reaffirming that Ned does know what he's doing. And it also highlights just how the murder of children is a moral canyon that Ned cannot cross, whatever the weather. It goes against, a lot of people like to say that Ned was out of his depth, he couldn't do politics, blah, blah, blah. But like I say, those later chapters in the later books show you Ned knew what he was doing, and I think George is just trying to give us a hint. That quick reference to Jaime being named Warden of the East, that was a very odd. I always forget about that. A little kind of subplot that didn't really become a subplot. It's weird because it just seems like a poor idea from any angle, where however you think of it, it would just throw Westeros into all sorts of political upheaval, which it does end up in anyway. So, maybe Robert is just going to cut a corner and get to it quicker. But yeah, I mean, can you imagine Jaime being Warden of the East? Jaime being named Warden of the East? No one's going to react well to that other than the Lannisters, which it does show how deep the Lannister claws are in Robert, because you've got this favoritism, nepotism type vibe, which happens all over the place, but the Lannisters and Cersei, as we'll see, get especially good at it. And that just would have been a terrible idea all around, I think we all agree. Moving to Tyrion II, we're getting closer to the end. So this is the one on the road for Tyrion. Tyrion and Jon, they're travelling through the wild north, and they have a bit of a discussion about what the deal actually is with the Night's Watch. I don't think we have very much to go through at all in this one. Let's just have a quick look. I think the main thing, pretty much the only thing I have to add about this chapter actually is it seems quite similar to Daenerys' journey at the moment, where so Jon is off now, he's on his way to this new life and this new world, and he's got there, and the curtain's been pulled back. He meets Yoren and the not so lovely recruits that he's joining, and Tyrion kind of points out, guess what, it's not what you thought it was. And although it's not direct comparison right now for Daenerys, it is similar in that you see one thing, you find another. Same with Sansa. She sees one thing, get into King's Landing, all land of wonders, all these balls and lovely dresses and all these nice knights in shining armour, blah, 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 and then pull back the curtain and it's something else. And Jon's not even there yet. So that's just a bit of a hammer over the head for him. Much like, he put the hammer in Stur's head in the show. Let's move on to Catelyn III, which is the one, what should we call this one? The one where Summer eats someone's throat. The one where Bran nearly gets murdered by the Catspaw, which is obviously a big discussion about where George was really going with this, and if he got a bit lost along the way. Certainly it seems so. It doesn't sit so well with many fans. Fair enough. I think Aziz actually got to my favourite part of this, which was the mutual finger injuries for Jon and Catelyn. How it's just good that they are emotionally distant as you can get, and they've got that similarity connecting them. He also, as he's mentioned, my kind of jumping the shark ideas about why they refer to Hodor as they say he's been acting queer, and in no way do I think this is actually what's going on, but in my own mind I like to connect the dots and think, well, maybe if they ever put some of that weird time travel stuff that they had in the show where Bran goes back and messes with Hodor, and it's all a bit confusing. If any of that ever filters through, maybe that's what's happening here, because at this moment where Bran's still asleep, as we're going to find out next week, his head is full of the three-eyed crow stuff, and it's going all weird. So maybe that's why. Maybe this is a point in time that Bran has to come back to. He has to mess with Hodor, blah blah blah. I don't think that's true at all, but it's just you see these things and you start connecting. Also, a big part, like a side part of this chapter, again as we mentioned, was you could really see Robb starting to grow up. We saw it in Jon's chapter already. We see even more in Catelyn. He's taking charge. He's doing the accounts of Lewin. blah blah blah. He goes off to sort the fire out, etc. etc. As he's got to my main point for that about Catelyn has a big influence on that, but again, that's setting the precedent for the story, because without Ned's gone, so Catelyn has to pick up the mantle of main teacher for Robb. He's going to have all these different men around him. He's going to have his Uncle Edmure. He's going to have his great uncle Brynden. You've got Great Jon. You've got Rickard. You've got Roose. You've got all these different people. And so even before Jane comes along and starts whispering in his ear as well, Catelyn's going to have to be in charge of that and really showing Robb what to do. And you can see it here where she's asking him, well, what do you think is Robb? And just trying to tease things out and trying to get his mind working a bit. And we just have a few more signs of Robb making the steps towards manhood. Roderick Cassel thinks now is the time for a steel sword, etc. Obviously, this is a really emotionally challenging chapter to read. Catelyn's in such a state of sleep and grief and all this stuff that's going on. And like we said earlier with Daenerys, you go from one extreme to the other in terms of her, being with a lot of people and then being alone. We get the same thing here in Kat's chapter, where it goes from grief-stricken, really is almost comatose, can't do anything, to at the end it's the complete opposite. It's I am Catelyn Tully, family duty honour, off we go. But the emotional toll at the beginning really sets a precedent for the rest of Catelyn's story. She's not really going to, even though she feels much better by the end of the chapter, it certainly isn't the end of her emotional toil. She's going to be pummeled more and more with news that it's just one blow after the other. All of them are going to want to send her back to this frenzied, grief-stricken state that we were introduced to at the beginning of the chapter. And she really only resists, probably, by the memory of what nearly happened to Bran because of it. And, she has this guilt, again, like we said previously, this guilt of being a failure as a lady, as a mother, and she has to go into full Tully duty mode, which she's hit on, definitely. I just kind of wanted to double down on, this is just what happens to Catelyn from now on. She leaves, and okay, she does have some, are we going to call them successes? Not everything is a complete failure for Catelyn, but emotionally almost everything is. She doesn't really get good news. I mean, Robb survives several battles, and it could be worse, but from here till the Red Wedding, it's not a lot of highs. So it's really George saying, this is the kind of story we're going to have. And personally, this is more just a details thing, but I always thought the decision to go to King's Landing herself was in error a bit. I can see how she got there, but I think maybe just sending Sir Roderick might have been best. I think if she can trust him with the information, she's going to trust him with the information to Ned. Maybe it was more a question of who's Ned going to believe. And, the stakes are high. So I can definitely see why she's entrusting it to herself. But I would have thought that the risk in just getting to King's Landing as two people alone, like just her and one old knight, maybe that is another sign actually, I've only just thought of this, of how, just how strong a grip Ned had on the north, that Catelyn can feel safe travelling. Because I don't think in the south people would ever feel that safe, but Ned's North, that's a good name. Maybe we should have called the podcast that, Ned's North. I think Ned's North was so safe and stable that, two people thinking about travelling as two people wasn't as much of an issue as it is obviously going to be in the future. Final note here on Catelyn III was there's a little note in there about Robb wants to open the window because he thinks the direwolves howling is going to heal Bran, and by the end of the chapter Catelyn's pretty on board obviously with Summer staying with Bran, and maybe that has something to do with Bran waking. I just wonder, maybe we're going to see that come back with Jon and Ghost. Maybe Ghost is kept away from Jon's quote unquote corpse, and maybe when he gets close again, we have Jon awakening, or maybe we get Ghost's first howl. That all kind of flies in the face of Jon walking into Ghost, which is a fairly common theory. We're all guessing at this point. We will find out. It's interesting to think about. Right, the last one, Sansa 1. I'm pretty sure, even as I scroll down here, that Aziz pretty much got to all my notes on this, but let's just double check anyway. We have to think of a name as well. The one where Joffrey cries. The one with the butcher's boy. No, that's a bit grim. We'll just call it the one with Sansa's big day out. Anyway, we know what happens. Sansa is supposed to go to the wheelhouse of Cersei. Instead, she goes on mega date with Joffrey, and it all goes terribly wrong. I'm sure we all remember. Aziz mentioned my note here about the little lick from Lady that makes Sansa smile, and there's a lot of just kind of just single sentences, short sentences that throw up this image of a little girl and what is basically her pet dog just being really, really cute, and knowing what's going to happen. That puts a toll on reading this chapter. It really does. I didn't want to keep reading. I know what's coming next week, and it really does. Yeah. On Arya, I said, Aziz mentioned this, I said that this chapter is very heavily about Arya, like that Jon chapter earlier. We're getting a lot of Arya in other people's chapters so far. And one of the things she says is about rubbing mud onto. She gets like sores from a flower or something that I can't remember off the top of my head, but she rubs mud on it, and it just makes me laugh. There's absolutely nothing wrong with rubbing mud onto a wound, is there, Drogo? No, nothing bad happens in this book from rubbing mud on stuff. Nope. And also Sansa gets frustrated about, Arya goes off, gets all muddy and talks to people, and then she comes back, and Sansa expects her to get told off for this because it's the worst thing someone can do, and Ned just hugs her, and Sansa doesn't really get it. And I think we can now kind of establish that he's seeing Lyanna in Arya, and especially there's a lot of things about flowers that connects to Lyanna, and in this case Arya was bringing back flowers, so there's a little bridge being made. And yeah, it's just another little hint by George in this early going. It's a lot of stuff. That's all before it all goes wrong, obviously. Then Sansa and Arya, Sansa and Joffrey, they find Arya and Micah click-clacking the swords, and it all goes terribly wrong because Joffrey, slap warranted or unwarranted, is a bit of a, well, not a bit of, he's just a massive, I won't say it, he's just horrible to everyone. And we have that, Sansa shouts at all of them to stop ruining it. They're ruining the good day, the picture perfect day. I think that really shows where she is, kind of in her growth, in her reality check. Before this thing with Joffrey happened, she had the perfect day planned in the wheelhouse of Cersei and Myrcella, and she was worried that something external was going to come and ruin it. In this case, it was Arya. She was worried Arya would come into her perfect day and ruin it. And then she beats that. She gets an even better day with Joffrey. And then again, external forces, it's Arya and Micah, I guess, again, come in to ruin it. And, they turn Joffrey bad, in Sansa's opinion. And it ruins this little bubble that she lives in, wanting nice laid out plans with nice laid out results. The idea, and that's probably what rubs up the wrong way about Arya, because Sansa wants it all to be heavily formatted and, very strict to the songs and tales she knows. Whereas Arya is messy and wants to go out doing a different thing every day, and it's not neat, it's not nice. So definitely, they clash that way, and obviously we know what's going to happen to Sansa's perfect little bubble. It's going to be burst. This is just the first instance of that. Speaking of Arya going off and talking to I can't remember who it is, but Sansa almost, you can kind of see Sansa looking down her nose when she's thinking, oh, she's talking to the whoever it was. I'm not going to look it up now, but the butcher's boy and the footman and whoever else it is, all the people who are just kind of there to Sansa at the moment. It's kind of the background. You're not supposed to talk to them, but Arya does, and it's a reflection of she's so much more like Ned than she is Catelyn. That's how Ned rules. He goes and talks to your men and those quote unquote beneath you, if you want their loyalty. Rob shows us that later on. He knows that's how you inspire loyalty and inspire command. And it's also about being honest. Arya is nothing if not honest. Whereas again, Sansa still on the side of everything being perfect and right. And that's not a knock against Sansa. There's no reason she shouldn't think that at this point. She's a 13-year-old princess essentially. So I think George did it intentionally that way to show how princesses actually are, and not so much the kind of as we would normally see them in fairy tales. And while that's kind of small microcosm example, it's going to have a big payoff later, because Arya's going to spend her journey kind of down with the, again, quote unquote, beneath people, and Sansa's going to see how her formatted fairy tales actually exist, and it's not going to be very pretty for either of them. And I think that is about that, everybody. That's the first Scrolls and Scraps, or Reserve Guard, or maybe I'll just scrap the whole thing, call the podcast Ned's North. I think that's a really good name. I'm going to have to save that for something. So yeah, there we go. That's just some spillover, some extra notes for you from these chapters. And like I said earlier, we will see if we require one next week. Maybe all the notes get used up. Maybe there's even more. Who knows? We will see, and I'll obviously let you know. All the props and thanks in the world to Aziz and Ashay for setting this up in the first place. And I can't imagine any of you are listening to this if you haven't already listened to the live stream. But if you haven't, definitely go to that one first. They deserve the credit, and they put the hard work in. Have a look at the Flip community and all their Facebook group and everything. It says really good stuff in there, some really good discussion. And I hope you will join us again next time, on top of later this week for our guest appearance, which we're looking forward to. Good to be back on the Other Faces. Good to have you all back. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.